everyone. Welcome to CFPR seminar series. We are jointly conducting this seminar along with sociology seminar series. So welcome sociologists, demographers, and the rest of you. It is a great honor to have Professor Zachary Zimmer with us today. Let me tell you, well, the introduction can take a long time because Professor Zimmer has published a great deal. So given that we have a short amount of time, I'll give a short introduction to Professor Zimmer. He is a professor of family studies and gerontology and Canada Research Chair in Global Aging and Community at Mount St. Vincent University in Canada. He studies an eclectic range of topics that apply a global demographic perspective to concerns of health and wellness of older persons. Recent endeavors include investigating religiosity and spirituality among older adults worldwide, effects of early life wartime trauma on later life health, trends in chronic pain, and intergenerational relationships in societies undergoing socio-demographic change. He has published over 100 articles in journals that cut across disciplines such as gerontology, sociology, demography, public health, medicine, and epidemiology. Without further ado, I'd welcome Professor Zimmer. He is going to be talking on early life war exposure and later life frailty among older adults in Vietnam. Does war hasten aging? We expect him to speak for about 35 to 40 minutes. Please hold your questions. You are welcome to type them in the chat box if you have questions during the presentation, or you can use the raise hand function and I'll welcome you to ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm going to, I assume that you can hear me, and I'm going to share my screen now. Let me see, I just need to do this. And I need to go to the beginning of my slideshow. All righty, well, thank you very much for having me. This is quite an honor. I've had a look at your series that you have, and people that have spoken in the past and are speaking this year, and so it's quite an honor to be asked to join this great group of speakers that you have. And it's a great opportunity to talk about this research and more generally, and a specific analysis that I'll be talking about. Specifically, I'm very sorry that I cannot be there in person. It has been my plan now for, gosh, year and a half or so to come and visit and work specifically with POOC on this project of ours, and the current pandemic has not allowed that to happen. I certainly hope to be there, you know, sometime maybe within this calendar year. I have visited Singapore quite a few times. It would be quite nice, especially in the winter here in Canada, to be in Singapore. So, so I am sorry that I'm not there in person. I'm glad we have the technology these days to be able to have these discussions in this way. I will get into it, and we'll go from there. And yeah, thank you for showing up. I know that this is not the regular time of this of your talk, so it's at an unusual time for you. So thank you for coming and to hear this. And I know that there's a few people, I could recognize a few names there. So hello to the people that I know, and it's nice to meet the rest of you. Okay, so it will not be a surprise to anyone to know that the Vietnam War was an extremely brutal experience. The number of deaths exceeded 3 million, more than half of which were civilian Vietnamese. The Vietnam War remains the largest aerial bombardment in human history, more than doubling the number of bombs that were dropped during World War II. The aftermath of the war resulted in enormous physical, psychological, and psychosocial challenges, as you can well imagine. And these effects were felt by both military personnel and by civilians. If we take a look at the timing of the Vietnam War, we can see that the cohorts who were of young age and young adult age and early childhood during the Vietnam War have now aged into older age groups. For instance, if during the height of the war, someone who was, let's say, 10 years old would have been 67 years old today. 20 years old would have been 77 years old today. And so the older population in Vietnam today are really survivors of this war, and it's also one of the largest populations in the world to have survived a traumatic experience like this, and now are moving into ages that are of particular interest to those of us who study gerontology. So these experiences early on in life are of great interest to those of us who study gerontology, especially those of us who study it from a life course perspective. So if you look at the population pyramid of Vietnam in 1965, you can see at the at the height of the American, what was Vietnamese called the American War, there was the largest cohort of the population were in those young ages, and they have aged today to be in the age group of 60 and older. So there were about 22 million in that prime war age group in 1965. Number of course, people died during the war. There are 13 million remaining today. So it's a very large population of individuals who survived a traumatic war experience. So in order to understand the experience of aging after a war, a number of us started the Vietnam Health and Aging Study. The principal aim of the study was to understand these long-term lingering effects of the war on health and aging. We originally received funding from the National Institutes of Health. We received further funding from the Canadian Institute of Health Research, especially to test some biological aging issues. And we've also received additional funding from the National Institutes of Health to study the impact of war trauma on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And we now have a very large project with a large number of collaborating institutions, including National University of Singapore with our colleague Puk, who is there, and other universities in the United States, Canada, and in Asia. So we have quite an international group of people studying this. In 2018, we collected what we call wave one of our data collection. This involved in-person interviews and biomarker data collection of adults in Vietnam age 60 and older, about 2,500. The survey itself covered a lot of topics, including the military participation, war exposure, health, work, assets, migration history, a lot of topics that are normally covered by sort of larger omnibus aging surveys, as well as a good bit of information on war experiences. And we also did biomarker data collection, which included blood and hair samples, anthropomorphic tests, things of that nature. The sample was a stratified random sample that came from 4 districts in Vietnam. And these 4 districts were purposely selected to represent low to high wartime exposure. So we sampled in both, for example, areas near Hanoi, which were not very much involved in the war, and in the southern part of northern Vietnam that were very heavily involved in the war. Across 4 sampling domains, male and female military and civilians. And our study is unusual in respect that we have a lot of females in our sample that served in the military and in militia, and we have a lot of civilians in our sample that were affected by the war without, not actually being combatants. We're currently involved in Wave 2 data collection. Our Wave 2 data collection has been a bit delayed, as you can imagine, because of the pandemic, but there is data collection that is taking place. We're returning to the Wave 1 respondents this year for a follow-up interview and data collection. For individuals that died, we are questioning next of kin for some information, and we're expanding our study in several ways on several other topics, such as to increase our information on physical activity, diet and food insecurity, more information on post-traumatic stress, reproductive history, depression, loneliness, and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias are topics that we're covering in our follow-up. So given that as a background of the study, you'll excuse me, my voice is a bit hoarse today. I'm going to present a particular analysis today, and that analysis today is looking at the degree of association between traumatic exposure during wartime and later life frailty. And this study attempts to advance current literature on war and health in several ways. First of all, I will say that in general, the connection between wartime experiences and health is not necessarily consistent, especially over the long term. There are studies that, of course, as you would imagine, there are studies that show detrimental effects of war experiences on later life health, but there's also studies that show a certain amount of resilience that develops when individuals are faced with traumatic experiences early in life and could actually be beneficial in some ways later in life. So there is some controversy on the connection between earlier life war experience and later life health. In addition, most studies on wartime experiences involve Western samples of individuals that have been sent to fight, not civilians. There's a lot of study, for example, of US veterans who have fought in the Gulf War or fought in other wars. And there's a lot of study that has been done on these individuals when they've returned. But people that were involved in war fighting and so close to battle as the civilians were in Vietnam is a bit of a more rare experience. And in addition, most studies that look at wartime experiences and how they influence health tend to measure war exposure in an additive index sort of way. And the specific types of exposures that are most impactful are generally not studied in this. As you'll see in what I'm doing today, we look not only at the amount of exposure that people have, but also the type of exposure and that influence on health. So again, the data is our Vietnam Health and Aging study. The sample size for this study is about 2,300. Few people missing because of, there's a few more in our data that are missing in this study because of missing data. The average age is around 70, about 60%, a little less than 60% are female. About 57% are civilians, 20% were in formal military, and about 24% were in militia. So there are two important measures here, an independent variable and a dependent variable. The dependent variable is frailty. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about this concept of frailty. Frailty is really a conceptual thing, and it's normally defined as a degree of deterioration that's experienced in normal, healthy function. And so those that have a high level of frailty are individuals that are at risk of institutionalization and death. So frailty is really a very general term for a kind of a late life, often late life sort of health deterioration, not in any one domain, but across a lot of domains of health. And so the approach that we use in measuring frailty, there's a couple of different approaches, but we use something that's called the deficit accumulation approach. And the deficit accumulation approach is an approach where we take a large number of health items and simply measure frailty across all of these health items in a way that creates an index. So for this particular study that I'm showing you today, we use 58 deficit items representing 14 domains of health, such as different kinds of diseases, illnesses, and functional problems. I'll show you more about that in a second. And we create a frailty score that is defined as the proportion of deficits that a person has. And so it's measured between 0 and 1 because it is a proportion. And so the different deficits that are measured here, you can see here are various chronic conditions, somatic symptoms, biomarkers, functional limitations, activities of daily living, and other kinds of domains of health. We end up with 58 items. And a frailty score is quite simply the proportion of these items that people report problems with or having some health issue with these issues. And the mean frailty score in our data set for the sample is 0.293, which means on average people report 29.3% or 17 of these deficits out of the 58. Now, frailty is such that just about there's practically no one that doesn't have any measure of frailty. If you're looking at the deficit approach, any one of us, if we look at these 58 measures at some point, may have one or two sort of health problems. We may have pain of certain degree, or we may not. Right now I have a bit of a problem with my throat. I've been coughing, so there's a couple deficits there. But it's when you get to the higher proportion of deficits and you start to get these multiple issues that it becomes problematic, and you are considered to be more frail. And you can see that in our data here, if we model the frailty scores of people between the ages of 60 and 89, women have slightly higher frailty than men, and it increases with age. So this is smoothed from a year-to-year basis, but you can see that our frailty score is almost really a biological measure of age, because it is so increases so consistently with age, and also is a very, very good predictor of mortality. Okay, so that's the dependent variable, which is frailty. The independent variable is war exposure. And we measure war exposure here using a latent class analysis method. And a latent class analysis method is a method used to group observations into classes based on similar response patterns. And in the study that I'm showing you today, these response patterns are based on various indicators of wartime exposure or specific kinds of war experiences. So latent class analysis uses an iterative maximum likelihood procedure to group individuals that have experienced similar combinations of experiences. And you'll see what those experiences are in a second. And what it gives us as an output is a number of classes, the number of unique, significantly unique classes that exist in that population, the probability that someone is a member of a class, and the likelihood that someone who's a member of a class is exposed to a specific indicator. And so for this study, we use 7 different possible wartime traumatic experiences. So it's whether people witnessed death firsthand during the war, whether they experienced sleep disruptions during the war, whether they feared for their own life, whether they knew someone personally, a close person, friend or relative who died or was badly injured, whether they personally were displaced from home because of war, whether they experienced food shortages or water shortages, or whether they lived in a region or an area that experienced intense bombing during the war. Those are the experiences. The second column is simply a descriptor, a word that I use to describe that experience later on, because I don't want to put the whole sentence in there. And then there's the percentage of people that experience those things. So these 7 indicators go into the latent class analysis. And what we end up coming out with is 9 different classes. That is 9 groups of people that are statistically unique, that basically experienced sort of similar ranges of experiences. And the way we show them here is, for example, here's the 9 classes. This is class 1 down here. I think you can see my arrow if you can see my screen. So if it's darkly colored, that means that people in this group most likely did experience these things. If it's lightly colored, people in that group most likely did not experience those things. And then the gray ones are, they may have or may have not. So you can see that in group 1, we have a group of individuals that experienced, these, that all would have experienced, or at least mostly would have experienced 5 of these 7 things. And at the bottom here, we have a group of people that wouldn't have experienced any of these things. And then, there's a bunch of groups in the middle that experience different kinds of things. So so there's a combination, sorry here. So it's a combination of both, the way this ended up grouping people is a combination of both number and specific experiences. And down here on the bottom, well, this thing's moving ahead where I don't want it to. Down at the bottom, you see the percentage of our sample that fits into each of these classes. So if I look at these classes in terms of the mean number of experiences to which members of the class were exposed, we can see that the 9 classes do range from a very high number of exposures in group 1 to a very low number of exposures in group 9. And in fact, we can kind of look at this in terms of, 5 sort of groupings within these classes. There's one group that has very high exposure to a lot of items. There's 3 groups that have all have an average of around 4 experiences. There's another 3 groups that have an average of about 2 to 3 experiences. And then there's a couple more groups at the end that haven't experienced that much. And so we call these the one group, those that were had extreme exposure. The second group of 3, I call a group that had heavy exposure, numbering them 1, 2, and 3, then moderate exposure 1, 2, and 3, then light exposed, and then the non-exposed group. So so it's interesting that it sort of classes in that way, but we can take a look at the heavy and the moderate exposure, since these are classes that experienced around the same number of things, and look at how they differ from each other. So if you take a look at the heavy, exposure group, the heavy exposure group number 1 likely experienced witnessing death, fearing for their own life, having been displaced, and intense bombing. Heavy group 2 experienced having witnessed death and knowing someone personally who died or was injured. And heavy group 3 witnessed death and had intense bombing. So all these 3 groups had the same number of experiences on average. And so this is the difference when I say, our study is looking at not just the number of exposures, but actually what you were exposed to. And we're going to see in a minute how that relates to later life frailty. For the moderate group, there are 3 of those. Gosh, this is so sensitive, this computer. 3 of those groups. The first group likely experienced sleep difficulty and fearing for their own life. The second moderate group was a group of people that experienced displacement. And the third group experienced knowing someone who died or was injured. Okay, so this is the main result of the analysis. It sort of mostly boils down to this. This is a fractional regression. It predicts frailty according to those exposure classes, controlling for a lot of other things. You can see on the right-hand side of the table There's, all of the things that we control for. So this is a, quite a heavily controlled model. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about anything but these frailty scores. There's a lot of other interesting relationships with frailty with the other control variables, but I'm just going to talk about the frailty things. And so you can see that those that are classed, people that fall into the extreme exposure group have significantly higher frailty scores than the comparison group, which is the non-exposed, and in fact have the highest frailty scores. And they're followed by the heavy 1 group, and then the heavy 3 group, then the moderate 1 group, then the heavy 2 group, and then the moderate 3 group. The moderate 2 group, interestingly, there's very little difference in frailty between the moderate 2 group and the comparison group, which is those that are non-exposed. So now these coefficients are a little bit difficult to interpret on their own because it's a fractional regression, so there's not a sort of an easy interpretation. So in order to make the interpretation a little bit easier, we calculated some predicted values, and this is the predicted age at which first a man, and I'll show you a woman in a moment. This is the predicted age at which a man is predicted to reach a frailty score of 0.3. So a frailty score of 0.3 is kind of an interesting division point because it is the score of frailty at which people tend to be at that level where they need to be institutionalized. They have enough frailty that they need to be either institutionalized or heavily cared for. And so, so this is the predicted age of reaching this frailty score of 0.3 for men. And so you can see that there really is a vast difference over time, indicating that there is a relationship of these exposures to aging itself. And if we look at the difference in years between those who were extremely exposed and those who were totally non-exposed, we see about a 17-year difference in how someone looks with respect to frailty. So the extremely exposed look around 17 years older than their counterparts that were not exposed. And even, and this is a big difference between, the most exposed and the least exposed, but there are other differences in between that are also not inconsequential. For women, we look at a frailty score of 0.35 rather than 0.3 because women's frailty scores tend to be a little bit higher than men, about 0.05 higher than men on average. And so, we can see that there's about the same 17-year gap between the most and the least exposed. And if we take a look at those groups in particular that have the highest frailty or become, very frail at the youngest age, we see that it's people that we classify in the extreme group, the heavy 1 group, and the heavy 3 group. So there's something about the heavy 1 and heavy 3 group, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That is common for both men and women. So for women, for example, on the right-hand side, those in the extreme or the heavy 1 or the heavy 3 group become, hit this high level of frailty at an age of around 70 years old. On the other hand, if you're in the non-exposed group or the moderate 2 group, you don't hit this level of frailty till closer to 90 years old if you're a woman, and also around 90 years old if you're a man. So there certainly seems to be a relationship between these exposures and frailty, which also relates to ages. So to summarize my results, and I'm going to summarize the results, and then I'll just say a few more words at the end to finish up about our project and what we're doing going forward, because I have a few minutes. So we do see that according to the way we've defined things here, wartime exposure does seem to hasten aging. Highest frailty levels are found among those in what we classify the extreme and the heavy 1 and the heavy 3 exposure classes. The lowest level of frailty are found among those in the non-exposed and the moderate 2 classes. The difference between these highest frailty and lowest frailty levels seems to be about 17 years of age. Now, there is a consistency in these classes that share highest frailty, and that is that they are people that in all 3 classes that had the worst frailty scores. They were exposed to a large number of experiences, and they were also exposed to witnessing death firsthand and high bombing intensity. Those are common experiences in all the classes that had the highest levels of frailty. The next highest level of frailty was the moderate 1 class, and these are people that were exposed to sleep disruptions and fearing death. And those are both sort of more psychosocial kinds of experiences early in life, and they also seem to have some association with later life frailty. Now, the lowest frailty classes are characterized by few, if any, experiences. So people that were not exposed to anything at all, or experienced only displacement. So the moderate 2 class is a class that did experience some things, but mostly it was displacement from home. And these people seem to be all right in later years. So the implications of the study I'll just give you a few that come to mind immediately, or came to mind immediately as I was putting together the presentation. First, we can see that war trauma, like other stressors, cause deleterious physiological responses. There is certainly a connection between war trauma and physiological health, and that these responses are things that we see can linger and can accumulate throughout life, or be latent and appear later in life, because we see the connection between the early life experiences and the later life health. And we see that these effects are also broad because our dependent variable here is frailty, which is not any single measure of health. It's not any single health experience, but it is a broad, multiple physiological system approach. And those people who have high frailty, may have deficits across all kinds of different health measures. The thing is that they have a lot of health problems. People who have high frailty, and it may be different kinds of health problems. But so we can say that the effects here are seen to be very broad, since frailty is our dependent variable. And we also see that intense bombing seems to be particularly consequential, and therefore may be the greatest cause of trauma. Bombing, of course, also may result in physical injuries if you are injured in bombing, but having experienced intense bombing was a common characteristic in those in classes that ended up having a high frailty. And we also see that displacement, people that were in the displacement only class actually did very well. This is a bit of a strange result. Other research certainly shows that wartime displacement is not necessarily good for health, especially people who are refugees suffer quite a bit. But we can only speculate that in Vietnam, the situation was a little bit different. Those that were displaced during the Vietnam War were not necessarily those going into refugee camps. Remember, we're interviewing people who are in Vietnam, so they remained in Vietnam. They were likely people moving to villages where family lived, and also moving away from combat zones. And so this displacement may have actually had some beneficial effect in terms of having people living with other people from whom they received support, or took them away from more inhospitable conditions. Okay, I'm just going to conclude with about 3 minutes here of telling you a little bit about where we're going now with this Vietnam Health and Aging study. There's a lot of work. What I've shown you today is one analysis that we're doing. There is a lot of analyses that are ongoing, and especially I want to highlight a few of the more innovative things that we're doing with our data. First of all, we'll be moving more into studies of biological aging. We're going to be performing DNA methylation tests on our blood samples to assess the epigenetic age. And so we're going to be able to connect some of these biological age measures that we get from self-reports and things like that with actual DNA methylation. It's going to be very interesting to see what we find there. We also are planning on a qualitative component of our study. We're going to be doing some in-depth interviewing of some of our respondents. We haven't done it yet. Of course, we have to wait until the pandemic sort of cools down. But given the results we found far, we are very interested to try and back up some of the hypotheses we have about the mechanisms that relate to that link early life trauma and later life health, and doing it in a qualitative way. We're developing a dementia assessment test to link wartime trauma to potentially chemical exposures during war and Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. There are hypotheses about exposure to chemicals. I don't know if this is written very well, but there is hypotheses about exposures to chemicals and later life dementia, and we're going to be testing some hypotheses in that regard. Longer term, our study, we hope, will continue, and we plan on studying the children eventually and grandchildren of today's older generation to assess the intergenerational transmission of the effect of wartime trauma. And this is something that we're able to do because we have this baseline data now on older people who experienced the war. We can now follow up with their children and other family members. And of course, there's lots of data analysis ongoing. For example, Pook and I are currently working on a paper that is looking at lung function and things of that nature, how it has been influenced by. We've looked at heart disease. We're doing all sorts of things, and of course, our data is very broad and allows us to do a lot of studies in various kinds of directions. We certainly will be looking at the mechanisms that intervene in these associations to determine whether there are what mediating and moderating effects exist to make wartime experiences more or less harmful. And with that, I am going to, that's right about 35 minutes, so I'm going to stop and say thank you very much again for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to now stop my screen share.
Thank you so much, Zach. It was a fascinating talk. Now the floor is open for questions. Vincent?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Vincent.
Hi, Prof. Zimmer. Thanks for the presentation. I thought it was fascinating research. I have, I suppose, two questions. The first pertains to the regression results, which I couldn't help but notice there was a negative relationship between alcohol consumption and frailty. Is it fair to say that in some sense, alcohol intake actually helps to mitigate some of the effects and to serve as some kind of a coping strategy, for this? Of course, it's a great trauma, but my alcohol consumption actually helped with that somewhat. The second question I have, I suppose, is you mentioned in the earlier parts of your talk about resilience and of how other scholars have identified resilience as a factor. Do you measure that in any way in the study? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Those are great questions. So excellent. I mean, I see that you've looked at the actual paper then. So
I saw the regression results with the factors that you've controlled for, and it was negative for alcohol.
Oh, I showed it was negative there. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. I was almost about to give you extra points for So we don't. I mean, we can only speculate, of course, on the findings of the alcohol results. But I mean, certainly you've provided one possible hypothesis. But there are other hypotheses. You know, in Vietnam, alcohol consumption is there's not a huge amount of alcohol consumption, and it's often people who are sort of wealthier that drink alcohol. So that's at least that was one of our colleagues suggested that as another possible explanation. So, you know, and of course the other it's kind of, you know, in a way there may be some selection factors there. Also that, you know, the people who, you know, continue to drink alcohol in old age, you know, they may be people who are selected for being healthier. So there's several possible explanations there, and you know, you probably, you know, mentioned one of them, but I think there are other ones as well. As far as resilience goes, I think we need. Our survey is very broad, and there is certainly a lot there. We did not in the first wave have a specific aim towards asking questions of resilience, but in the second wave we did then add some questions that are directly related to resilience, and some of the people who have done resilience studies, you know, have suggested some questions that can be used. So we'll be able to look at it more in the second wave than we were able to in the first wave. I was not until, you know, more recently. I was not in tune with all of this sort of resilience literature. Now I know that there's an entire field out there when it comes to aging research that revolves around resiliency. And of all the different things that I've studied in my life, I never came across sort of all of this resilience literature that I'm now coming across. So I do wish we would have had more in the first wave, but there are some items in there that we can use. We will wait until the second wave when we have a few more specific items on resilience.
I suppose it's you know, it's common to think of resilience as a trait. It's either you have it or you don't. But I think that's not. You know, one of the predictors of resilience could even be your social network. You know, the social support system that comes around you that then makes you resilient. So one potential factor to control might be the social support factors, and you know, yes, the trauma is there, but if a network comes around and wraps around the person, then that might help the person to be resilient and then makes it a bit better at least.
So it's an excellent point, and we definitely are going to be as we go forward. We're definitely going to be looking at social support. We have a lot of measures of family and social support and things of that nature. I tend to think of it as potentially moderating effects. For example, you know, people who had the same trauma but have different support may have different outcomes. But now, you know, the word resiliency comes up so often now, and I guess part of the thing is, you know, like you say, part of it is it may be a characteristic. So psychologists talk a lot about the characteristic of resiliency and have a lot of, you know, there's a lot of studies that ask questions about, you know, your attitude about life and things like that we just didn't do in the first wave. You know, I guess we were short a psychologist perhaps in the first wave of our data collection, but you're right in both respects. I mean, one is that we could consider it as a characteristic, and we have seen measures in wave 2, but there's a lot of, besides social support, you know, there's other things as well. There's the social support, but there's a support from you know, comrades and you know, neighbors, and there's also you know, physical activities and leisure activities and all kinds of things that people can do to allay the effects of trauma. And so far, you know, we're going to get into it, but we haven't done it yet. But we plan on looking at those things and seeing, you know, what it is that are the mechanisms through which, you know, the early life trauma ends up affecting. Because maybe it affects everybody, but maybe not.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have other questions? Okay, if not, I have a few. I was quite intrigued to see that you included a stress index as a control variable. Can you hear me?
Right, right.
Because I suppose my instinct would be to see it as an outcome, because there is an elevated stress response that perhaps lingers over extended periods of time. And that's why we see this physiological deterioration associated with trauma and stress. And therefore, I suspect that stress is likely a mediator between exposure to wartime trauma and physiological health outcomes.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. It could be. So our stress indicator is the specific stress indicator, and I didn't go into details about the way all these different things are measured. So the stress indicator, there's about I don't know how many items there are, but it's sort of recent stressors, like whether a spouse died, whether there was a recent sort of. So, but they are more recent stressors, right?
I see.
But
okay.
But you've got a very but the point that you're making though is still valid in that the question, how do you then control for the stress that goes on throughout life, because the trauma that we're looking at occurred 50 years ago. Now we're looking 50 years later. A lot has happened over time. And, it would be great to be able to, look at all that time period and see stress as a mediating effect, and how the trauma of war led to more stressors. We hope to deal with some of this in some of our qualitative work that we're going to be doing. I think the qualitative work could be very interesting. I'm, personally, I'm not a qualitative researcher, but we've recruited a qualitative researcher who has studied war trauma qualitatively to work with us. So maybe in that way we'll be able to dig into those longer term stressors.
I suppose one thing that you could test is just use the stress index as an outcome variable. Yes. And assess, right, to see if there is an impact. So then if it is there, then we know that even, and perhaps that's another paper and not this one, that even this elevated stress, even across more recent events, could be associated with these, historical trauma.
Well, it is now going to be another paper, because it's an excellent idea.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, but I will save it for later. Do we have other questions? Okay, so Zach,
it was incredibly clear, and
yeah, it was a great presentation.
Comprehensive, and it's early in the morning.
I have another question. I'm quite intrigued by your outcome measure, the deficit accumulation. And so is this an established measure? And if so, are these differences by gender also established? Because I see that you had a different threshold for predicting, healthy age, or when the deterioration starts. I'm sorry, Zach. So I remember your slide where with different life expectancy, no, not life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, was it?
In this presentation?
Yes. So you speak about particular ages when health deterioration.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yes.
I can put the slide back up if you want.
Thank you.
What it is, okay, I'll put the slide back up and I'll talk, because I know what you are to what you're referring, and let me just go back here. Let's see here. You're referring to this.
Right. So predicted age to reach a frailty score of 0.3. Yeah.
Okay, so let me address the first issue of whether this is an established measure. When you get into the frailty literature, you see that there is a lot of debate about the best ways of measuring frailty, because frailty itself is a concept, right? Mm-hmm. It's the concept of a general deterioration, and so what is the best way of determining? And really, the most practical point of view, the reason people measure frailty is to get some indication of biological age and nearness to death, so that there should be some relationship between this frailty score and how long a person is going to live. So there's a couple of different established ways of measuring frailty, and this deficit approach is one. So the answer to your question is yes, it's established, but what is not established is, or what is true about this particular frailty approach is that it doesn't matter really which indicators of health you're using, as long as you use a lot of different ones. Do you know what I mean?
I see.
So,
yes.
Yeah, and so this is, I mean, this particular way of measuring health was popularized by Ken Rockwood, who's a gerontologist, and some people that he works with, and they have published a lot on this particular method of measuring frailty using different populations and putting together different indicators of health.
Mm-hmm.
And they have always found that as long as you use a lot of standard measures, it doesn't matter if it's this one or that one, but as long as you have a bunch of standard measures together, you generally get similar sorts of results. So it is that way, and it is established that women tend to score slightly higher scores than men, women, because women live longer with a higher level of frailty. So
Sure.
That's why this 0.3 level for men and 0.35 level for women is a sort of are kind of equivalent in terms of how long the predicted amount of time that you're going to live. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So men, have less frailty. With less frailty,
Sure.
live the same number of years as women with
Mm-hmm.
greater frailty. There are a couple of other ways of measuring frailty. It's a very interesting sort of area of research for people that are interested in gerontology, especially people that are interested in old comorbidities and things of that nature.
Wonderful. Do we have additional questions?
Yes, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
No.
So Zach, can you say a few words about what's the role of sort of PTSD or psychological well-being in terms of mediating this relationship?
That's a good question. I have to return to my model, and just give me 1 second here. I'm just flipping back to my model to make sure that I give you the correct answer there. Okay, so PTSD is not one of our control variables in this analysis, and it doesn't really come into the frailty score, except maybe there's a couple of items that may relate to PTSD that are part of the frailty score. So, I mean, we know that's a good question, though, and I think it's something that we could explore a little bit more in detail on the degree to which
another paper.
Well, I mean, I would think the degree to which PTSD is a mediating factor between early life exposure and later life frailty, I guess would be an important thing, and I'm trying to remember whether we had any discussions when we were working on this paper on how we were going to treat PTSD. There are a couple, obviously within the frailty index, there will be a couple of measures, psychological measures in there. And so they are going to be things that are, somewhat related to PTSD in one way or another. But I think for sure, PTSD as a mediating factor is an interesting way to go. So there's another paper for us, Pook.
I see Mujang has a question. Mujang?
Oh. Hi, Professor Zimmer. This is Zheng Mu. I'm a colleague of Kriti and Puk at Department of Sociology here. And so actually I have a minor clarification question. And so regarding this different kind of exposure to the war. And so it seemed that in terms of typological like categorization is very detailed. And so I'm wondering that given that the goal of this research project is to look at the cumulative effects, and so whether or not the timing or like the age of this exposure will also play a role in these effects, right? And so like how many years has been passed may actually have like very different influences, right? And related to that, I guess I want to revisit Vincent's early question about social support. It seemed that now, so basically several familial factors like number of children, marital status are all insignificant. So I'm just curious that is that possible that to account for the timing of those life events as well, right? The timing of getting married, the timing of having children. And so if those like timing factors can be built in the model, it is possible that at different point, right? And so it could provide like a different level of coping or resilience. Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting and comprehensive talk.
Thank you, Mujang. And again, very good comments and very pertinent, and I'll address them. First of all, again, address them by saying, that we have a lot of data and we have a lot of analysis that we plan on doing. The first thing that you mentioned about timing is something that is front and center in our analyses right now. So I'm working on a paper with a colleague of mine on age of exposure and some later life outcomes. We've looked a little bit at age of exposure and some psychological health outcomes. There is a lot of literature about age of exposure of traumatic events and whether someone experienced them when they were, very young, let's say, under 5 years old versus, let's say, as a young adolescent. There's also there's research that looks at, in utero, it's like, things. So there are these, and you're right. I mean, in that age of exposure seems to matter. It's also a very tricky thing to model and to look at because there's so much that has taken place sort of in the interim as well. But we're working on a paper now. I am with a colleague where we're looking at age of exposure, and especially with respect to the bombing intensity. So bombing intensity ends up having a very strong impact on our later life health outcomes. And so, whether this bombing occurred when someone was, in very formative ages or later on may in fact matter. And so with respect to social support, we saw that some of the variables in our model were not significant. But this particular model does not go into tremendous detail on the social support side. So I think we can dig much deeper into, the variables that we have and look much closer at the kinds of relationships that people have with their kids. But again, timing is definitely important. And the degree to which we're going to be able to get that, with the data that we have we will see. But it's definitely something that we have in mind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zimmer, for being here and giving us this absorbing, wonderful talk. We learned a lot, and we wish you the very best in your research. I have a short announcement to make that next week we will be meeting at 4, where we will have a talk by Professor Mutarak Raya, who will speak on population dynamics under global climate change. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and special thank you to Professor Zimmer for being with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.